Hi, Scott Grove here from Easy Inlay, and in this episode, I'm going to show you how to work with epoxy, specifically to create a domed lens over an inlay or on top of an inlay if you want. And this is a great project. You can use it for all sorts of different inlays. I've used it for creating thin inlays. Work with our power pieces to do that kind of encapsulated inlays. You can do what's called an exposed inlay and pigment the resin. Just lots of ways, even small inlays with opal. So specifically, I'm going to be showing how to do this sort of insert for this three-sided multi-axis turning box. We're going to do two types of epoxy applications. One, we're going to control the viscosity and just drop the epoxy on and let the surface tension create a low dome. That's was created on this one here. And in fact, this type of application doesn't need any polishing. You get a gloss finish on top of that. And with this type of application, you don't have to do any polishing. You can get a mirrored gloss finish, very much like a bar top. The other application we're going to be doing is doing a casting, where then down the road you can go back and turn this and create a domed lens. You can get a much higher dome and really create sort of this magnification. In this case, you'll need to sand and polish that. And I'll be covering sanding and polishing epoxy in future episodes. So let's go ahead and start with this. So I first basically want to talk about epoxies. There's all sorts of epoxies out there, from adhesive epoxies to bar coating epoxies to thick castings. We've all seen those river tables. So in this case, it's critical to know sort of the set time or how hot the kick is of the epoxy. Epoxy, when it cures, there's a two-part component, A and B. You typically mix them 1 to 1 or 1 to 2. There's a ratio. We'll get to that in a bit here. But the key is that it creates heat. It's exothermic, and that helps the curing process. But the more heat it generates, the faster it kicks. The faster it kicks, the more heat it generates. And if it has thermal runaway, which means that process exponentially increases, it can overheat, getting over 125 degrees, and then cause yellowing of the epoxy, shrinkage, and or cracking. So it's important you pick the right epoxy for the type of inlay or casting you're doing. So for example, on those river tables where they're casting, 1 inch or 2 inches thick, that's a lot of volume, and you need a very slow curing epoxy because you don't want it to have that thermal runaway. Well, if you use that type of epoxy on a very thin coat, we're only, casting 1/8 of an inch deep here, it will take forever. It could take 30 days for it to cure, and who wants to wait that long? So you want to pick an epoxy that has a faster kick. So in general, you want to get a coating epoxy. These epoxies that are used for bar coatings. They're designed to go on very thin. They have surfactants in it, so it allows the bubbles to release. They can sort of self-level and work really great for these type of inlays. You can't use those types of epoxies for, say, anything over 1/4 of an inch thick. You can probably push it to 3/8, but you want to monitor the temperature on that. So just in general, a good coating epoxy. I actually like Alumilite. This is the clear cast, but there's a variety. There's Total Boat, there's System 3, the West System. They all have their sort of bar coating epoxies, and they all work. I just, for whatever reason, I just kind of like this, but I have used all the other epoxies also. So one of the little kind of hints here, if you will, whenever you're putting epoxy onto wood, there is going to be exotherm, even with these thin coating epoxies. The epoxy is going to heat up. What's going to happen is that heat is also going to heat the air inside the cell structure of the wood, right? And that air is going to expand inside the wood and create bubbles. So it's really important that you seal the wood first to prevent those bubbles from sort of leaking out into the epoxy. You might do an epoxy coating and there's no bubbles, looks good, and you come back 15 minutes later and there's all these bubbles and you're like, where that's coming from? That's what's happening. It's expanding the air inside the wood cells, and that is sort of bubbling up. So whichever type of casting you do, thick or thin, you always want to seal the surface first. That's really important. Depending on the type of inlay you're doing, you may want to coat that channel black, but we'll talk about that in another episode when we're doing our opal inlay. But in this case, we're using a PowerShell sheet, so we don't need to treat it with black. You could coat the sides black if you wanted to, but again, we'll get into how I sort of pigment the channels in a future episode. So let's go over to the lathe. We're going to just show you the void that I have, and we're going to go ahead and seal that. And let me show you what that's about. So here I have my void. I've already mic'd this. I've already made my Pauaa disc, which I covered in a previous episode, and that dimension there matches the inside void, so I know my size is good. And before we seal this, one thing you want to think about is the angle of the dome. So if the resin is going to be overcast and sort of kind of angling up, one tip that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to angle that side. Now I have a very, very thin, boy, that's like a 32nd of an inch wall thickness. So before I go ahead and seal this, the one thing you want to consider is the sort of the height of the dome. And usually that resin is going to come off a few degrees kind of at an angle. So what's important is that you bevel that edge to help go with the future carving of that resin, if that makes any sense. I have a very thin wall here, but I'm still going to just bevel that just a couple degrees. And that will help turning the resin much easier down the future. Okay. So as I mentioned, I have open pour here, and you're going to want to be sure that this grain is sealed. In the past, I've demonstrated using the Solarez. That's a UV cure resin, and that's sort of my resin of choice. I do like to show that you can use a variety of resins to seal that. In this case, I'm actually going to seal it twice. Since I have such a thin wall, I want to give that cell structure just a little extra sort of support. So I'm going to be using Glue Boost Ultra Thin. This is really great stuff because it's super, super thin, and that's going to absorb into those pores and really sort of soak in. So I'm just going to kind of put that on there. I'm going to coat the entire thing, come around the outside, and sort of let that soak in. I can't hit it with the Accelerator. As I mentioned in the past, the Glue Boost Accelerator is really great stuff, or the whole line of CA glues, is because the Glue Boost does not bloom or blush the CA glue, which is where it turns white. But I can hit that, and that is already cured and good to go. But in this case, I do want to hit it with one more coat of CA glue, just to be sure that I've sealed the grain really well. This thin CA glue may have soaked in, and there's still sort of open pores, if you will. So here I'm going to be using the Glue Boost Fill and Finish. This is the thin version. It still just puts a fine coat on, doesn't really build up too much, and that will ensure me that I'm getting a nice sealed surface. So I'm going to go ahead and put a coat of that on there. Again, I can also hit it with the Accelerator. And I'm feeling pretty good that that is now a nice sealed surface, so I don't have to worry about any of the epoxy expanding the air in the cell structure. So that's dry. What I do like to do is just give it a little tooth. I'm going to go ahead and hit this with just a little, this is just 180 sandpaper. You can see how that sands really nice. That's just going to take off any raised fibers and also give me a little tooth for my application of my PowerShell. One trick that I like to do, if you can, is leave the plug in the chuck. and we're going to be doing our casting right here. The reason being is, I don't know, it always seems that every time I take this thing out and put this back in, it never centers exactly. And I'm very concerned with such a very narrow wall thickness. If I took this out and put it back in, it might be a fraction of an inch out of center, and then that wall thickness will vary. So by leaving it in the chuck, I'm ensured that the center is going to be correct when I put it back on the lathe. Let's go over and install this power shell. So now I'm ready to install my inlay, and again here I can just inlay the disc, but at this point you could literally inlay anything. You could inlay bits of power shell. One little tip here is that if you go to your big box store and go to the key making department, you can get free brass inlay, which is always kind of fun to inlay. So there's a variety of things that you can do, but we're going to stick with the power shell sheet. In this this particular one, I already took off the backing and cleaned that. The power shell sheet typically comes with a PSA backing, and that simply peels off and will stick down there really well. But as I said, this one doesn't have that, so we're going to go ahead and glue this in, and we'll just hold it down and let the CA do its job. In this case, I'm going to hit the void with a little accelerator first, and that will help accelerate the glue. But I'm going to drop this in there, and I'm going to use the ultra thin glue boost to sort of wick down underneath there. So if this power shell had the PSA backing, which it typically would, I would just press this in, and I would still go ahead and use my ultra thin glue boost and sort of dribble it around the side. That just ensures some extra bondage and also helps that seam. Again, there's air under there, and that air could sort of seep out and just cause bubbles. So bottom line here, bubble management is certainly something you want to think about. Another thing that I didn't do ahead of time, hindsight being 2020, is I always like to sort of scuff up the surface of the power shell. That also just gives a little tooth for the epoxy to grab onto. You can clean the dust off with alcohol, or in this case, I'm going to use this little canned air, kind of blow that off. Okay, so now we're ready to create a dam. So I like to use a high temperature tape. This is specifically for vacuum bagging when there might be a lot of resin, a lot of exotherm. You don't have to use that. You can just use regular clear packing tape. I've got this in stock. It's a little thicker. So if you are using packing tape, maybe you get a thicker brand. It just helps keep those walls nice and straight, if you will. But it's, again, really not that big of a deal. I'm going to go ahead and take this and just wrap this around. Now the one key here is that where this seam is, if you kind of think there's an overlap, and there might be just a little triangular void. So I'm going to take my fingernail and just really push that in to make sure there's full contact all the way through, because the last thing you want is epoxy to seep out that little void and down into your chuck. That would be bad. And when I do pour my epoxy, I'm going to pay special attention to that. I haven't had a problem yet, but it always kind of gets me a little nervous. But I take special attention to really sort of press that down. So here you go. So I've got a nice dam, and I want to make a tall sort of rim. I'm only going to be pouring about, I don't know, an eighth, quarter inch of epoxy in there, but you definitely want to have more dam wall than you're going to pour. The last thing you want is to sort of try to pour this up to the top and have it spill over. So let's talk about mixing some epoxy. So on this one, I'm going to go ahead and pour the epoxy and overfill. On this little baby here, I'm going to try to do a dome. I'm going to chill my epoxy to raise the viscosity, make it thicker, and see if I can drop that in there and let the surface tension just create a slight dome. If nothing else, it'll be a glossy surface and I won't have to polish it. So if you're lazy and you want to get something done without polishing, that's a good way. So we're going to do sort of two pours here. So let's talk about mixing epoxy. Epoxy is typically mixed by a ratio, either 1:1, 1:2, 1:3, 1:5. Usually these type of clear coating are 1:1. Some of the higher end sort of epoxies will also give you a weight ratio. So instead of 1:1 by volume, so they might give you a weight ratio like 42 to 58, something like that. And certainly if you have the opportunity and you have a fine scale, measuring out epoxy by weight is much more accurate than doing it by volume. Now, epoxy is a sensitive ratio, so you want to be as close, if not right on to that mixing ratio, 1 part A, 1 part B. And if you're mixing, a gallon of each and you have a couple drops extra, it's no big deal. It's such a small percentage that you're off by, it's really no big deal. But when you're mixing small volumes, boy, one extra drop could throw that mixing ratio off by, say, 5 or 10%. So that's something you really want to pay attention to. So when I'm mixing epoxy by volume, and by eye, if you will, I like to use these little calibrated shot glasses. They're disposable. You can buy 100 of them for a few dollars, and it just makes it really easy. They've got the calibration right on side in ounces and cc's and whatnot. The only problem is that I can never see those calibrations very well. So what I would like to do is if I'm mixing, say, 1:1, and I'm mixing a total of 10, I will actually put a line on there showing the 10 cc's and then a 20 cc's. If you want to be really precise about this, you might use 2 shot glasses, pour 10 in each, and then pour both of those into another can. And the reason I do that is if you're pouring 10 cc's of part A and then you pour 11 cc's of part B, you're like, oh no, so then you gotta go back and put another, try to keep those ratios the same. This way, if you have 2 shot glasses, you can sort of pour 10 cc's or 11 cc's of both and have them side by side, and you can actually see if the ratio is exact. That's another way of doing it without even having to have a graduated scale. So if in fact you could just do this with a salsa cup, you can simply pour part A in one and part A in B, and as long as they're on a level table and they line up, then you're good to go. So that's another safe way. The key is you don't want to take one part and pour it into the other container. Reason being is there's always some slime or coating of the cup that you're dumping out from, and that's going to throw your ratios off. So if you're going to do it with this method, you'll want to take both cups and pour them into another cup, scraping the sides or leaving the same amount of goo on the inside of the cup so that waste is sort of equal, if you will. So that's a little trick there. But for small quantities, some epoxies actually recommend don't mix less than 6 ounces. Reason being is because of this whole ratio thing, and their epoxies are very sensitive in their ratios. So the best way around this when you're working with small epoxies is to get some of these large syringes. So I have these 2 large syringes. I get these, I think, at Woodcraft or online, and I fill them with part A and part B, and I clearly mark them. And the key here is that I calibrate both of the syringes or the plungers to the same level, meaning I'll fill them up and I'll squirt the excess back so these both will come out to be 1.5 ounces or wherever, but they want to be equal. Reason being is now I can dispense 1 cc, 5 cc's, a certain amount. It doesn't really matter. I don't have to think about cc's. I just want to dispense what I think is going to fit. And then I do the same on this side. And if the phone rings in between and I lose track of, was that 2 or 6 or how many cc's did I measure? It doesn't matter. As long as I have the plungers line up on both of them, I know that it dispensed the same amount of epoxy. So this is the way that I do it. And it's just a great method to really mix and pour out precise amounts of epoxy, or precise equal amounts of epoxy. So we're going to go ahead and mix some. I'm simply going to use a salsa cup here. I like these silicone mats too. Nothing sticks to it, so if I dribble, I can peel it off, and they even make little silicone trays to kind of keep your mixing sticks and stuff. Just trying to keep clean is always a good idea. So this first one, we're going to go ahead and mix just a small amount of epoxy and pour it in our sort of open pour, if you will. And let's go ahead and do that. So here I'm at 41 cc's. And we're going to push out 6 cc's. So I'm ending at 35. Same sort of thing here. And at 35. So now I know I've got the same amount of epoxy mixed. I didn't really have to do any math on that. So whenever you're mixing epoxy, it is very important you thoroughly mix. And when you mix, make sure that you clean your mixing tool and scrape the sides and the bottom, because you can have whatever part you put in first, say I put part A in first, that could be sort of coating and slimed around the perimeter. And if you don't get that off, again, your ratios are going to be off. And you want to read the instructions. If it says mix for 2 minutes, mix it for 2 minutes. Now, as you're mixing it, you are going to be introducing air bubbles, and bubble management is a big concern. In this case, I'm not going to do anything about that, because I want the surface tension and the viscosity to be as sort of high as possible. So we're going to rely on the surfactants in the epoxy to sort of come out and pop. And we're going to be a test. And usually this works pretty well. But you can see it kind of starts looking white, and you can see large bubbles, and also it turns white. A lot of times epoxy will turn white and then they'll clear up. I can also control the viscosity by either thinning it with a solvent. You can use acetone, denatured alcohol, or it's actually better to use lacquer thinner. Lacquer thinner is a little slower in volatility, so it'll stay in there faster. Acetone or alcohol can flash off a little too quickly. You can also heat it up. So we'll be doing that in our next pour and showing you how I heat up the epoxy to lower the viscosity. And after I mix it, I usually let it rest for a bit, and that allows some of those bubbles to start migrating to the top and popping. And as you can see, that's what's happening right now. Now, a lot of people will use heat or a heat gun to pop those bubbles. That's great. It also heats up the surface and lowers the viscosity. But in this case, I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to use compressed air. The canned air actually is cold when it comes out, which actually could be good because it would raise the viscosity, but it might raise it too much. Well, let's give it a try. That sort of breaks the surface tension and pops some of those bubbles that are on the top. So in this type of pour, where I'm just pouring and I don't want it to spill over the side, there's going to be some surface tension. It's going to have a very slight dome. Don't get crazy about this. It's very minimal, if you will. But getting just the right amount can be sort of a game. I like to use these sort of disposable eyedroppers. That helps me really get precision in there. But let's go ahead and try a pour first, and we'll see how well I can do. And if you can see that iridescent really starts to light up. You want to pour it in there and let that sort of flow out. And at this point, I can start kind of playing some games, and I can see if I can add just a couple more drops and see how high I can go without it spilling over. And this is where it's kind of a crapshoot. And if I go down here and look on the end, I can see that I'm built up just ever so slightly. And we're going to stop there. Obviously, you want to keep this on a level surface, and it certainly needs time to release all those air bubbles. you can go ahead, and this is where it's kind of a crapshoot. If I hit it with too much air too quickly, I could break that surface tension and sort of spill over the edge. But I can come in here and spray the surface like that. Another thing that you can do is actually spray alcohol on the surface. That also will break the surface tension and release those air bubbles. Let me get some alcohol. So here I got a little denatured alcohol. I'm going to spray the surface, and that will help also pop the air bubbles on the surface. Hopefully won't release that surface tension too much and it'll spill over the side. There you go. That's pretty good. One thing you want to do if you have a dusty shop is make sure you cover your pour, because there could be some ambient dust that just kind of settles in there. And in fact, I had a fly land in my epoxy. So you want to protect your casting, especially on this type of pour where I don't intend to do any polishing. I want sort of that off the gun or off the pour sort of finish. So I'm simply just going to take a cup and cover that, and that will help protect that. So let's move on to our next one now. So now this one we're going to do a casting, and we're going to overcast or over pour, and I'll turn and polish that down to a much steeper. So when you're pouring thicker castings, bubble management is always a concern. A thin coating you can certainly hit with alcohol or maybe just heat, and for like those bar coatings, that works just fine. So here with a thicker casting, I'm going to want to lower the viscosity, making it a little thinner, so the air bubbles will release more. In addition, I'm going to over pour, so any bubbles that sort of migrate to the top and don't pop, they'll be above the area where I want to turn. I hope that makes sense. So how do we lower the viscosity? We can do that a number of ways. One, with heat. And what I do is I'm going to take my syringes, or you can take your epoxy bottles, and just put it in hot water. There's a hot water bath. Just setting it in here, and that's going to raise the temperature about 10 degrees, usually what you can go. Another way you can lower the viscosity is adding a little solvent. They make epoxy thinners, and again, lacquer thinner, alcohol, or acetone will all do that. Some epoxies say you can thin it 50-50, meaning 100%. That's pretty aggressive. Even 50% is a little aggressive. I usually like to go only 5 or 10% to help lower the viscosity. So we're going to do sort of all the above to make this as sort of thin as possible, so the bubbles will release. So I've preheated this. While I'm going to do that, I'm going to get some solvent. So one other thing you can do to really eliminate all bubbles altogether is take your epoxy after it's mixed and put it in a vacuum chamber. This is a little more advanced. I'll be covering this down the road when I do a larger sort of casting. And this requires sort of a vacuum chamber, and you need a vacuum pump, and it gets certainly a lot more involved. And then you can also do pressurized castings. So what a vacuum chamber does is it takes those bubbles, and by putting in a vacuum, makes those air bubbles enlarge and pop, sort of raise to the surface. Very much like opening a bottle of ginger ale, where there's like no bubbles in there. When you release the pressure, all these little bubbles expand and pop, right? So this is sort of doing the same thing. You can also do pressurized casting, which is sort of in reverse. I put pressure under that, takes those bubbles and pressurizes them down and makes them invisible. As I mentioned, this is a little more advanced, and we'll be covering this in a later episode. So let's go ahead and mix the epoxy. I'm going to go ahead and use the same syringe system, and this time it's been heated up. You want to make sure you drive off your syringes to make sure to get any water in the mix. And I can feel this is already warm, so it's also going to be a little thinner. Again, here I'm at 35. I'm going to squeeze out 10 cc's. Now I'm at 25. And I don't know if you can tell, but that flows just a lot easier. And this is just, you can just already tell that this is a lot thinner. Again, mixing very well. Scraping the sides, scraping your stir stick. And I don't know if you can tell, but there are certainly less bubbles that are forming just because of the viscosity is lowered. So after I've got this thoroughly mixed, I'm going to add just a little bit of lacquer thinner. Also, again, to lower the viscosity and make this even thinner. But I want to make sure I thoroughly mix that lacquer thinner into the epoxy. There's like no bubbles, there's very minimal bubbles that are in that down in there. There's, a few in there, and I'll show you how to get rid of those. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. One other trick that you can do is if you see sort of bubbles floating at the top, and often when you pour those bubbles are going to be the first thing that go in. Again, we're going to want to overfill our mold, and any bubbles in there are going to be above our sort of turning profile. But there's one more trick that you can do. You can, in fact, use a heat gun and take a heat gun and kind of hit the surface to pop those air bubbles that are a little stubborn. So if you don't use the hot water method, you can use a heat gun to sort of heat these up. Keep in mind that these salsa cups have a low melting temperature, so you can, in fact, melt your plastic container if you get a little carried away there. So now I'm really good, and I'm ready to do my pour. When you make your pour, you just want to pour in one location and let it flow out. You don't want to sort of be dribbling all over. That can actually create an air pocket. I can, again, also hit this with my heat gun if I felt like I was just anxious and I wanted to get rid of those pockets on the top. And that's another reason why I use the high temperature tape. So here we go. So now we're really good with our pour. We want to make sure that there's no contaminants that are going to settle in there. I'm simply just going to cover this baby up and I'm good to go. A couple things you can do to accelerate your cure of epoxy. So epoxy shouldn't get over 125 degrees. That's sort of the thermal runaway threshold. But epoxies do take 24 hours to fully cure. Now you can sort of take them out in 12 hours. They're kind of still soft, if you will, but you can turn them. But it's very difficult to get a high polish when they're not fully cured. So you can put them in a sort of a homemade oven. So I have a shop light here, and I even put a thermometer in there. And by putting this up on a couple 2x4s, I can create sort of a nice warm environment. Usually this has a 75 degree incandescent light bulb in it. It will create about a 100-degree environment. And it's worth noting, for every 18 degrees you raise the temperature above 70 degrees, it cuts the cure time in half. So here you go, simple sort of curing oven. I'm going to want to monitor this temperature just for the first 20 minutes or so to make sure it doesn't have thermal runaway. If it starts getting up to like 120 degrees, I would take the light off or raise the light up. Sometimes you can also let that thermal runaway sort of peak, and then it'll sort of peak and then just level out and start coming down. That may take the first hour or so. After that first hour, then you can apply the heat. So I have just a sort of a thermometer here. You can put that down there and keep track of what's going on, or you can use an infrared thermometer, kind of shoot under there and see what the temperature is. And I'm going to shoot right there, and right now it's just increasing. We're at 75 degrees, so it'll take a while for that to heat up. And you can certainly monitor the temperature by lowering the 2x4s or lowering the lamp. You can certainly you can certainly control the temperature somewhat by raising and lowering the lamp also. So that's how you do a casting over an inlay that you can turn and create sort of a domed element. In the next episode, I'll be covering how to turn and polish that domed lens. Hope you enjoy this. Thanks again for watching. Please subscribe. Email me with projects that you have. Love to feature them on this site. And see you next time.